intending to take a call on this bill, but the speech that we've just heard from Gareth Hughes has motivated me to do so, sir. The ACT Party will be supporting this bill, and sir, this infrastructure bill provides for a new Utilities Access Act and makes a number of amendments to several acts to remove a number of legislative barriers to infrastructure development. And sir, Mr Speaker, certainly don't we need those barriers to infrastructure development lifted. This is an omnibus bill of 4 parts and covers 3 areas. It covers changes to utilities access arrangements to transport corridors. It makes changes to the New Zealand Railways Corporation Act 1981, and it repeals certain aspects of the Affordable Housing Act 2008. But Mr Speaker, as I said, I did want to comment on Mr Hughes' speech because he preceded his speech by making some general comments on infrastructure. And sir, those comments can't go unanswered, because it always fascinates me, Mr Speaker, when people stand up in this House and criticise the government's decision to build roads. I find that fascinating, Mr Speaker, because by far the most common form of public transport, sir, is buses. And the last time I checked, buses actually travelled on roads. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, buses travel on roads. And sir, where I live in the Tamaki electorate, the electorate of Mr Peachy, we've just had some special bus lanes put in, some transit lanes along Tamaki Drive to make very, very efficient use of those roads. And Mr Speaker, as I walk along my daily exercise along Tamaki Drive, I ask myself the question, why wasn't that done 20 years ago? But commenting also on what Mr Hughes said, he criticised the government's decision to build roads. Well, I find that quite fascinating, because I actually stood in the Mount Albert by-election against Mr Hughes' leader, Mr Norman. And Mr Norman advocated that we should be building a $3 billion tunnel under Mount Albert. And sadly, Mr Speaker, yes he did, and I shared many platforms, Mr Norman, where he advocated that he criticised the government for not building the full 3-kilometre tunnel under Mount Albert. And the great tragedy, sir, is that's exactly what the national government's now doing. They're spending $2 billion putting a 4-kilometre road under Mount Albert when a $500 million surface highway would do. But sir, Mr Hughes also made the point that the government was doing very little to address climate change. He made the point that the government is doing very little to address climate change, and sir, that's also demonstrably untrue. And the reason I say it's demonstrably untrue is because, sir, on the 1st of July this year, this country, New Zealand, will be the first to conduct an experiment. We're going to experiment with 4 million New Zealanders. We're going to put taxes on our electricity, another form of infrastructure, Mr Speaker. And from the 1st of July, electricity will go up by 5% and the price of petrol by 4 cents a litre, sir. And these aren't my words, these aren't my assumptions, Mr Speaker. These are the assumptions of the New Zealand Treasury. The assumptions of the New Zealand Treasury, and adopted by Mr Alan Bollard in his inflation forecast less than 2 weeks ago. And if that isn't enough, Mr Speaker, we had Mr Richard Bentley, the Chief Executive of Meridian Energy, say to the Finance and Expenditure Committee last Wednesday, the Meridian will certainly be adding their carbon taxes to the cost of their electricity. Moving on to the issue of housing affordability and the need to put infrastructure in, sir, to ensure that we can have affordable houses. Well, I ask the question, why are houses unaffordable? Well, sir, there's probably a couple of reasons for that. One, because they cost too much, and let's look at why they cost too much. And the second issue is New Zealand's incomes are too low. And I ask the question, why are New Zealand's incomes too low? When it actually comes to the cost of housing, we have in Auckland the Auckland Regional Council that has put a barrier around Auckland. It has put an artificial barrier around Auckland, such that land inside the Auckland urban limits is some 10 times more expensive than land immediately outside. And so if Auckland was allowed to grow, I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that the price of land, of subdividable land, land that people couldn't put affordable housing on, would be so much cheaper. And certainly, as for the level of income, well, if New Zealand incomes were 25% higher, if they were actually at the same level as Australia, houses in New Zealand just might be that little bit more affordable. So, Mr Speaker, the ACT Party will be supporting this bill. We will be voting for and supporting the infrastructure bill. But let me repeat again, Mr Speaker, I totally refute that this government is doing very little to address climate change. It is conducting a massive experiment with the people of New Zealand. The ACT Party and the 5 ACT MPs are the only members of Parliament who are standing up for regular New Zealanders who will face a 5% increase in electricity from the 1st of July. And so the only thing sadder than electricity going up by the 1st of July when it needn't is that had we a Labour government, Mr Speaker, electricity would have already gone up not by 5% but by 10%, because the Labour government intended to introduce an emissions trading scheme that would already have increased the price of electricity by 10%. And so we saw overnight, as I said to the House earlier this afternoon, the French government, President Sarkozy, has announced in the last 24 hours that France will not be proceeding with its carbon tax. And I say to John Key, I say to the ministers of the national government, and I say to all members of the National Party, it is not too late to abandon this expensive experiment, this expensive ETS tax that none of our top 3 trading partners, Australia, United States or China, are pursuing. Thank you, Mr Speaker. The ACT Party will be supporting the infrastructure bill.